Welcome, everybody, and happy Hum Day. So I'm glad that you can join us at this edition of Cloud Talk, where we will discuss how the everyday actions that we take can have a global impact on the environment. So we have two speakers today, both of whom are environmental advocates. But before I introduce them to you, I would like to thank Rolex, our partner for today's session. So as a brand, Rolex isn't only known for its well-crafted watches. For a very long time now, it has also been a proponent of innovation and positive change. So in 1976, the watchmaker actually created the Rolex Awards for Enterprise to mark the 50th anniversary of its very iconic Rolex Oyster wristwatch. So the awards have been designed to celebrate as well as support inspiring individuals who are addressing some of the world's most pressing needs and challenges. And their innovative projects and solutions have helped to widen the human knowledge of issues that may be less supported by traditional philanthropy and have transformed lives. So these individuals are called the Rolex laureates, and we have one of them joining our panel today. So across the world, there are only 155 laureates, and their work span from preserving cultural heritage to protecting oceans to advancing innovation in science and healthcare. So in the 21st century, Rolex is laser focused on catalyzing the impact of individuals who are making the planet a better, more livable and more sustainable place. So as part of its Perpetual Planet initiative, it is helping to raise awareness and elevate some of these projects that I mentioned that are protecting our planet. And now it's time to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Dr. Emma Kemp, who is a marine biologist. Her research focuses on the physiology, ecology, and biogeochemistry of coral reefs. So Emma is also the deputy team leader of the Future Reefs program within the climate change cluster at the University of Technology, Sydney, where she also started the Reef Biogeochemistry group in 2020. Dr. Emma is also a Rolex laureate, as well as a National Geographic explorer who is just as passionate about the involvement of girls and women in STEM as she is about coral reefs. Our second panelist is Gen.T honoree Natalie Chung, who is the co-founder of Hong Kong-based social enterprise VERE, which promotes sustainable tourism and climate education. So VERE offers eco-tours in Hong Kong, environmental education workshops and events, as well as travel recommendations with insights on nature conservation through its online platform. So in February 2023, Natalie will be embarking on a very exciting expedition to Antarctica alongside renowned explorers such as Sylvia Earle to discover the impact of climate change on the region. Moderating the discussion is Gen.T's Regional Editorial Director, Lee Williamson. And to our audience, we welcome you to use the chat box below to share comments or questions. So if you have a question that you would like to ask to any of our panelists, you can post it in the chat box and we will get to it during the Q&A segment. So I'll now pass the time over to Lee to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Xiaowei. Good afternoon, or good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. The wildfires that tore through parts of Europe and North America in just the last 2 weeks, a result of the scorching heat, are the latest deadly consequences of human-caused climate change. According to a recent UN report produced by more than 50 climate scientists, the frequency of such devastating wildfires will continue to surge, with a 30% increase predicted by 2050. Wildfires, melting glaciers, tropical storms of ever-increasing strength. It's all too easy to consider the massive effects of climate change and instantly switch off. It's too big. It's too scary. Nothing I do will matter anyway. But the impact isn't academic. It's very real. So we have to start getting real too. And if you think that nothing you or I can do as individuals will help, think again. That's what we're here to discuss today in this panel. And I'm delighted to bring in Dr. Emma Kemp and Natalie Chung to do just that. So let's begin with a definition. Emma and Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. What does the phrase local action, global impact mean to you? Emma, perhaps you can kick us off.
Thanks, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here today. And please put any questions you've got in the chat. We're really excited to answer them later. So for me, local impact means that anybody, anywhere can make a difference. And we have to change our mindset to think that individuals can't make a change, because we just know now that that isn't the case, and that if we want this global change and this global impact, we want to address climate change, it takes each and every one of us to evaluate our own actions, our own businesses, our own commitments to ensure that we have that commitment that we need to ensure a better future for our planet.
Natalie.
Yeah, for me, I guess very much similar to Emma. Local action means that understanding our individual efforts do add up. And a lot of the efforts and a lot of the changes are actually pushed by individuals, no matter it's activist work or advocacy in the policy agenda. So as long as we are able to aggregate our voices, we can demand the government and the private sector to do something differently and to rethink the whole business model, how it should be circular, and how from the design level, we can integrate sustainability and concepts of regeneration in our design.
Before we get too much into the actions that we can take to reduce the effects of climate change, perhaps we can talk about some of those effects. I mentioned in my introduction some of the most dramatic consequences of climate change, but what about the smaller stuff, Emma? I mean, what are some of the other ways that climate change is affecting our everyday lives for the worse that many may not even attribute to our changing climate?
Yeah, look, I would actually say there isn't a part of our life that isn't being impacted by climate change. Our food security, disease prevalence, our access to resources, all of these are being impacted by climate change. And I guess for myself, I'm a marine biologist, a coral scientist, and something that people may not be aware of is that we're losing coral reefs around the world through climate change. But what does that actually mean? If you're not in a reef-bearing country, what impact does that have if we lose these systems? Well, say a coral reef, if we lose that system, we lose all the ecosystem services that provides. And that includes, for example, compounds that are used in pharmaceuticals. So there are compounds derived from coral reefs that are used in cancer treatments and hearts, disease medications. And so if we lose these systems because of climate change, things that we fundamentally rely on are going to be lost with them.
So there's so much at stake, some of which is obviously visible to us, some of which is equally important but is not as apparent. I want to ask a question to both of you. Natalie first. Many people, given what is at stake, many people have an all or nothing mentality because of how big the stakes are when it comes to activism. What would you say are some of the advantages and drawbacks of that approach? And what model do you personally subscribe to?
That's an excellent question, Lee. I feel like a lot of people do think it's either I become vegan or I eat meat. I love eating meat. And people seldom see the connection between like a small action and how the small action step can lead to a much bigger change, be it around your surrounding and influencing people around you. So instead of doing something very differently, I would recommend an incremental approach. If you are a meat lover, maybe you can try some new products like Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger, and try to take substitutional behaviors that can still give you the same enjoyment, but at the same time can reduce environmental impact. And even for a small switch, like switching from plastic toothbrush to a bamboo toothbrush, can already save so much plastic, given that you switch your toothbrush every 1 month. And when you calculate that, you can understand even you're not doing something very transformational, a little habit would count and could contribute, accumulate to bigger efforts.
Right. Emma, would you concur?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything Natalie said resonates with me. And I think that iterative approach that Natalie mentioned is just so key. I hear from people over and over again that they don't see how they kind of can make a difference, or the changes that they may be able to make are so small that they feel insignificant in the scheme of the challenges that we're facing. But if everybody took that approach, we would be going backwards. But we're not. We're seeing positive change already. And that's all stemmed from one individual somewhere making a choice to do something differently. And with that, momentum builds, and then 2 people make that choice, and then 3 and 4, and eventually you've got a whole movement of people traveling in the same direction to actually force and change the tide and the direction of how things are heading.
So we don't need to eat a completely vegan diet and go on holiday via sailboat to make a difference, right? There is some middle ground. On that note, I'd love to ask both of you what some of the habits are that you've incorporated into your lives to reduce your impact on the environment, that if we all did, would have a truly global effect, Emma.
So for me, one of the biggest ones has been to assess the flights that I take. I'm a marine biologist. I travel to study reefs. So one thing I look to do is, do I really need to take that flight? Is there other ways for me to get to sites? If I do have to fly, can I meaningfully offset that travel, or can I pull trips together to try and limit the number of flights that I take? Definitely the types of foods that I eat, and really trying to understand the circular economy that is associated with that food. And we heard from Natalie a little bit about this, but for me, as you know, I think I'm relatively aware of what's going on in this space, but actually when you start to kind of look into certain products, you realize that there's actually more, it's more complex. The full circle and cycle of products needs to be considered to really ensure that we're having the positive impact that we hope that we are. So just educating myself as well in terms of the choices and the decisions I make. And finally, I would say, you know, if you're able to vote and that you have that privilege, that you're really educating and understanding where climate fits in the agenda for the people that you're voting for.
It's not just about your consumer choices, it's about standing up and being counted politically as well. Natalie, what would you add to that?
Yep, for sure. I think in this day and age, a lot of companies are claiming their net zero target or carbon neutral, but it's very difficult to assess which one is actually doing it, or doing it with accountability and enough transparency for consumers. So there are sites online where you can assess company whether they are really achieving their targets, such as a website I discovered recently called greenwash.com, where you can enter a brand and they will tell you whether this brand has done some greenwashing before. So I think this is a great way just to get informed as a consumer. And adding to Emma's point on flights, and obviously I run my own ecotourism business in Hong Kong, and we started with the concept of hoping that people would cut off the flash flights, especially before COVID. A lot of Hong Kong people tends to travel quite often, and little did we realize that contributes to over 20% of our per capita carbon footprint. And these figures are often not accounted for because they're transboundary emissions, and government also don't have very strict regulations around that. So I think really discovering eco-tourism hotspots around you and try to understand the communities, and you'll discover there's so much more worth visiting than just to take a short flight to Taiwan or Japan for a short-term entertainment.
Right. At Bear, Natalie, your travel-focused social enterprise, you teach environmental education workshops, I believe. I'm wondering if there's one lesson in particular that really surprises your students because of either how simple it is to execute, or conversely, just how challenging it is to stick to.
Yep. I feel like when we do ecotourism and when we host educational workshops, there are some very simple rules that people may not understand, or even the impact of doing something. For example, a few of my friends asked, what difference could we make by not using plastic straw, and why would plastic straw end up in oceans? I guess Emma might be able to add more to that, but telling them how the whole ecosystem works and what are the ways that sometimes rubbish could get into ocean even though we throw them into the rubbish bin. For instance, there used to be a lot of rubbish bins along hiking trails in Hong Kong, but they are all removed now. That's the reason behind it is, even though you throw them in the rubbish bins, sometimes wild animals could come over, and cows, they might mistake it as their own food source and eat it accidentally. Or some monkeys, they would play around the rubbish bin, and then all the bins end up going into the soil and decomposing into the soil into toxic materials and microplastic. So I think educating people about how our consumer choices would lead to environmental impact without our attention. That is a very core part of environmental education, and telling them about the whole value chain, how it works, how a strawberry gets planted in a farm in the USA and get transported here, how much emissions is involved in the transportation and the freight. So I think telling them about the full story behind every consumer product.
Right, education is key. You mentioned earlier the eco tours that your social enterprise there organizes. Could you help to define for those who may not be as familiar, including myself, what exactly is an eco tour and how does it differ fundamentally from other forms of tourism?
So ecotourism is defined as a kind of tourist activity that relies on natural resources and the ecosystems as a source of education and entertainment. And there are some regions which are very highly ecologically sensitive, like marine protected areas. For those areas, we wouldn't suggest doing an eco tour there. So for the areas that are open for research and education are usually those that are slightly less sensitive as an area, but they still offer very valuable insight and valuable species for people to observe from a distance. And nowadays, we also have a new term called the regenerative tourism, which is something a bit more than ecotourism, not just observing nature and preserving it, but also doing some behaviors or carrying out actions that can add positive impact on the environment, such as tree planting, coral reef restoration, like adding some 3D structures underneath the ocean to allow corals to rehabilitate and to rejuvenate. So these are some of the tours that we've been hosting recently, allowing tourists to take actions that can help add positive benefits to the nature, which is make it even better than before you travel to that area.
Wow, I love that idea of not just treading lightly, not making an impact, but regeneration, actually working to make the environment better while you travel. That's fantastic. You mentioned, Natalie, earlier some of the personal decisions we can take, and Emma did as well, around our travel habits. What would you say, though, are the biggest challenges facing the tourism industry as a whole in its efforts to reduce its carbon footprint? It's a huge polluter, right, air travel?
Yep. I guess for me, I would say the biggest challenge in tourism is still aviation. For instance, the development of sustainable aviation fuels and how do we get that up to speed. I understand that a few airlines have been investing heavily on these alternative fuels and doing a lot of research, but there are still some technology bottleneck and reasons that they cannot be widely commercialized. And I guess the next step is the biggest challenge is carrying capacity. As I mentioned, some areas, they're really sensitive, and if there are too many people traveling on a place, that would lead to exploitation of some natural resources. So I think it's very important to do real-time monitoring of different ecologically sensitive areas, such as installing AI systems or satellite imagery to monitor that place and to ensure that the traveling capacity would not be exceeded, so that we can learn and educate our tourists at the same time, but not exceeding the planetary boundaries and exceeding ecological ceilings of that particular habitat or hotspot.
So, I mean, the personal choices we can take is choose to fly less. But of course, for the airlines, for the industry, that's not the way capitalism works, right? They don't want people to fly, less frequently. It will be innovation will be the solution, is what I'm hearing from you. I think we all read recently that some airline carriers have been experimenting with cooking oil as a fuel and have done some test flights using cooking oil, which is phenomenal. So I suppose watch this space. Emma, the rapidly declining coral reefs, just to change gear a little bit, obviously is your area of expertise. And that is one of those issues that is easy as an individual, as I said in my introduction, to really feel helpless to prevent. The people who are watching this today, who want to start making a difference, what should be their first steps? How can they really start to go from A to B to C to start to take actions to contribute towards this cause?
Great question, Lee. And I would begin by answering that by saying that anything you can do to reduce your carbon footprint will have an impact positively on coral reefs. That is undoubtedly the biggest threat to coral reefs globally at the moment. So that can be what we've talked about in terms of reducing your flights, reusing clothes, reusing products, repurposing, upscaling, looking to, the choices that you make as a consumer. But a step further with that, I would say, is also to engage with nature and not see it as this entity that is separate to us. We're very much connected. And so if you live near a coral reef and you can get engaged with, any science or any tourism that is going on, there is lots of ecotourism, obviously, as we heard from Natalie. And here on the Great Barrier Reef, we're increasingly working with tour operators through something called the Coral Nurture Programme to get more stakeholders actively engaged with the management and conservation of reefs. So that means that when individuals come out, they can learn about the problems, and just by educating yourself, you're contributing knowledge to, that can translate to solutions. The other thing I would say is to not assume it's someone else's problem. So again, it's thinking about what skill set do you have that could be used to come up with innovation. You mentioned innovation, Lee, and I think that is absolutely what is needed and what is going to get us kind of through the challenges that we now face. We're not going to be able to change all behaviours. Some of them have been embedded for years, but what we can do is look for innovation and new solutions to make the future better and not feel like we're stepping back in time by having to sacrifice things that have now become a part of our everyday life. So I guess my take homes would definitely be to explore innovation, to think how you can engage, and to look at ways to reduce your carbon footprint.
Emma, over the last few years, what specific technological innovations in the fight against climate change or for reef preservation have excited you the most, or do you think has the potential to have the biggest impact?
So there's lots. This is a tough one. There's lots going on. I mean, for me, one of the key things has been some of the smart sensor technology and some of the AI and robotics, and that's because for the oceans, we know more about some parts of space than we do about the deep ocean. So we still have a fundamental knowledge gap, and if we don't know what's there or what we're losing or how it works, then we can't manage and conserve and look at innovative ways to better protect it. So for me, this sensor technology that can help us understand the changes, the tipping points, the vulnerable areas, the areas that have got a better chance of surviving has been really key.
As well as an environmental advocate, Emma, you also work tirelessly to encourage more women and girls in STEM, which of course can make a massive difference to what you were just mentioning. Can you share a little bit more about the work that you're doing in this area and the potential impact on the environment, not to mention innovation in general, of more women and girls in STEM?
Yeah, look, thanks, Lee. So I think for me, where my focus for kind of women and STEM engagement first spanned was that I learned that when we think about climate change, actually women and minority groups are going to be disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of climate change. And so they have to be part of the solution. They have to be part of the voice and the discussion. They have to have a seat at the table to ensure that we have the capabilities to best manage climate change. So that has been one of the motivators. And for me, when I was, in high school, I didn't have, female scientists coming into the university or into the high school, into the primary school to talk to me about science and what it was. My view of what a scientist was, an older, grey Einstein looking man, because that was just my perception. And we have to change that. People, I really believe if people can't see something, it's really hard to believe you can be something. And so we have to provide these role models and get kind of these diverse, role models out there to ensure that we're encouraging and motivating engagement of women and girls in STEM. And so for me, that's involved doing lots of public talks, school talks, challenging, through discussions with the government and local government, how we can meaningfully engage women and girls in STEM. This has involved also talks at the UN about what it means to have women and girls in STEM. And for me, a really crucial point is not just getting women and girls into into STEM, but keeping them, because that's the big challenge depending on where you are. But for us here in Australia, is a really big challenge. We can get women and girls into a lot of the sciences, engineering not so much, but a lot of the sciences we get them. That's great, but we don't keep them. So when you look at the high paid CEO positions, the professors, the chairs of departments, the women aren't there in general, and that's a problem. And that's something that we have to tackle institutionally around ensuring that we are creating an environment where women and girls can feel safe and thrive and survive. And so that's kind of really where that's become a passion.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Natalie, first off, thank you for contributing so much to the chat box with those great links. And as a reminder to our audience as well, I will be turning to audience questions in the chat box in about 10 minutes. So please do get your questions in for Emma and Natalie, and I'll be sure to get to all of them if I can, certainly as many as we have time for. Natalie, as we've been touching upon in the last few minutes, it's not just down to us as individual actors to solve climate change, right? It's also down to us as employees, as citizens of countries, to band together in larger collectives to amplify our voices even further. With your experience in climate advocacy at conferences such as UN COP25, what have you seen as the most disruptive solutions to accelerate carbon neutrality in Asia and across the rest of the world?
Yes, I definitely agree that we need to gather together to amplify our voice for carbon neutrality. I guess one recent solution that a lot of my master's at Oxford classmates are talking about, and also professors, is having a fossil fuel take-back regulation, a mandate. Because I guess on the activist side, a lot of people are pushing for an immediate transition from fossil fuel energy to renewables. But in reality, especially in Asia, we know that this is not going to happen because there are still so many coal-fired power plants in China, in emerging countries in Asia, like in India, etc. So how do we ensure that we have enough transitional gas, such as natural gas, before we can fully transition to renewable energy and before the technology is up to place? It's by mandating all the fossil fuel companies to pay for carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, direct air capture, or other negative emission technologies for each further ton of CO2 they're emitting to the atmosphere, because we know that there are still so many natural gas and coal-fired power plants in operation. So they're earning immense profits for what they're selling and by leveraging these very limited natural resources. So we think that in order to bridge the gap, they should be the one who pay for these expensive CCS technology, so that for each further amount of coal or natural gas they're burning, we are able to mitigate the impact on climate change.
Of course, Emma, speaking of innovation and bold new ideas which are moving the needle forward, which Natalie just covered, the Rolex Awards for Enterprise recognize individuals who are doing just that, right? Making a difference and helping to solve some of the world's biggest challenges. How does being a Rolex laureate for yourself empower you as an advocate for reef preservation and sustainability? And what has it meant to you to be part of a prestigious program? I believe there's only 155 of you in the world. It's a pretty elite group you're in.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, look, it's been a huge honor and privilege to be one of the Rolex laureates. And, you know, through their support, I've had financial support to conduct some of the innovative research that we've been looking at to try to find corals that have got a better chance to survive climate change. That's kind of the premise of my research, is to try and find the naturally tolerant corals and ask how can we use that in innovative solutions to actually ensure that some reefs persist into the future. And then obviously through the network that Rolex has, having the opportunity to speak about the work, to get the message out to a greater and more diverse portfolio of people, has ultimately been, you know, game changing in terms of my other efforts to ensure that we as scientists are actually getting the research that we're doing out there. So I think that's where the Rolex Awards have been really helpful.
Right. Fantastic. I mean, we've talked a lot over the last 25 minutes about successes, of which there have been many, and we're making so much great progress in general in terms of innovation around the climate. But as we all know, there were always a few brickbats along the way, right? So I want to know, as we begin to wrap up and go to the audience Q&A, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you personally have faced on your journey, and how have you overcome them? Natalie?
That's a very great question. And I've been asked this quite often in the past few years, especially facing the younger generation. They're trying to get into the field of sustainability. They would also like to understand how difficult it is and how do we overcome the challenges and fears. I think for me and for a lot of fellow climate advocates like me from around the world, our biggest challenge is to get the message across to people who don't care about climate change at all. So Yale University, they did a study on climate change communication since 2007, which divides America into six types of people, like people who are very alarmed about climate change, concerned, and as well as people who are completely don't care at all. They completely are not concerned about climate change. So how do we motivate those people? And I think the important thing is really to segment our audience and to target our message to different groups. And I also remember reading a book by a Swedish author called What Do We Think About When We Don't Talk About Global Warming? So the book is about how we need to tell people who don't want to care about global warming at all that they need to do something about it. It is by speaking on relevant issues such as healthcare, how climate change is actually accelerating COVID-19 and the negative impacts of it, because areas with higher greenhouse gas emissions and with more air pollutants, people are more likely to die from COVID-19. And there are also other issues such as reducing distance between men and nature and men and wildlife, leading to more animal-borne diseases to be spread and to become pandemic like monkeypox. So I think getting these messages across would be a great way to overcome the challenge of disconcern and disengagement towards climate change.
Absolutely. Emma, what about you? What has been the biggest challenge, a big challenge that you have faced, and how have you overcome it?
So I would say probably the biggest one Natalie just touched on, and that has definitely been the same in my field, is, you know, if we take the impact that climate change has been having on reefs as an example, we've known for decades, but we're still facing this challenge, and it's because of the reasons that we just heard about. So I will give a different answer, although that I think that the one that Natalie gave is definitely probably my top response. But I think the second, maybe more personal response is the challenge of keeping going, you know, as an individual that's so passionate about something. So again, I'll go back to coral reefs. I'm seeing them die in my lifetime. I'm questioning whether my children are going to see coral reefs, and that's despite all my efforts as an ocean advocate, as a scientist, as an innovator, to see change. And so we have to work out how we don't burn out. How do we, as communicators, as scientists, as climate activists, keep our motivation, but also keep our mental health in a position where it just doesn't feel too much? And this is a challenge, but I think it's something we're becoming more aware about. We're talking about the impact that, you know, climate change is having on our health and well-being, and that includes our mental health. And I think that finding ways that we can see we are making a difference, and trusting that if we continue to do that as a collective, we will see a better future. And for me, is the way that I've kind of overcome that and used it as a motivator, rather than something that causes you to kind of just step back and feel that it's too big or too much to get involved with.
Right, and we all have a role to play in that, right? No matter what your profession, you know, climate scientist or not, people such as myself in the media have a role to play in communicating it. As you mentioned, communication is key, and it's also very, very heartening to see just how many people are joining us on the Wednesday lunchtime for this panel discussion. That shows that people are engaged with the topic, they want to speak more about the topic, and thank you all so much for joining us. Last couple of questions from me. As we wrap up, people are going to prepare to go eat their lunch across Asia. What is one simple, non-intimidating message that won't have people going la 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 la, you know, a non-intimidating message that you recommend we can all go tell our friends as we eat, like a little thing that they can do to start to make a difference? Natalie.
I think it's to start adopting a planet-friendly diet. So maybe it's not turning vegan immediately, but adding some of the products like beans in your diet. Eat more beans because even though like I think bean is a great source of plant protein that can help replace meat, and also planting beans as a legume that fix nitrogen in the air to become natural fertilizers for the soil. So actually eating more bean can improve soil quality overall. Yep. So
I love what you eat more beans. I love what you said in the chat box earlier. Think about a low carbon diet, not low carb. Low carbon, not low carb. That's fantastic. Emma.
I would say challenge yourself. What is it that you're really good at or you're really passionate about? You know, whatever it is, media, accounting, I don't know, whatever it is, and think, how could you turn that skill set, that passion towards doing good for the environment? And is it just communicating the challenges that the environment is facing? Is it looking at novel ways to account carbon credits? I don't know. There's just, anybody can come up with novel solutions, but I would just encourage you to engage with the problem so that you can then become part of the solution.
Finally, if our audience remembers one thing from this panel discussion in 6 months, 12 months time, the one soundbite you want them to go away today ringing in their ears, what should it be? What's the key takeaway, Emma?
For me, it's that we're connected to nature, and the choices we make now will determine our health, well-being, and that of the environment in the future.
Natalie.
For me, it's to go and explore your surrounding, immerse in the nature environment and ecosystems, and think of what you can do to make it better than before.
Great, thank you both so much. All right, let's go into some questions from the chat box. Some have been coming in. If you were a little bit worried or didn't want to put your question in, feel free to do so. We'll still look at new ones that are coming in. But first, let me go to one from Heidi Young, who asks, when did you first become aware of the need to be more eco-friendly? And what was the change you made early days that you stuck to? So, was there one kind of catalyzing moment that made you start to be aware of our precious climate and how it's not something to be taken for granted? Whoever wants to jump in.
Maybe I can start first. For me, I've said this a million times. I was inspired by a polar explorer in primary school. So she showcased photographs of the melting glaciers. Obviously, at that time, I didn't really know about the poles and the glaciers, so that imagery was really powerful for me. That's why I believe in the power of education, like how one imagery can spark my interest for my entire life. And one thing that I stuck to was actually stop using plastic bottles, because in the past, I think even though I've seen those glaciers, melting glaciers photos, I wasn't aware that using plastic bottles would contribute ultimately to melting ice. So drawing that connecting all the dots and understanding how one small behavior, like stop using plastic bottle, stop buying plastic bottled water and bring my own bottle out, could contribute so much down the value chain. So I encourage everyone to challenge yourself and stop buying plastic bottled water for your next, 30 years of life.
Absolutely. Cheers to that. With my reusable bottle. Emma, what about you? Was there an aha moment, in your adolescence that made you kind of set you on the journey you're on today?
Yeah, look, so I always had a love for nature and for the environment, but I guess for that real commitment to changing my everyday life came from meeting some reef communities in Indonesia, and seeing how fundamentally reliant they were for every part of their life. So in terms of the resources to build their houses, from the foods that they ate, that if that reef was to go, they would have nothing. And I was like, wow, I've been in a privileged position where the reef is providing me services, but not everything that I rely on to have a future. And that was really a moment for me that I was like, we have to do something, because there are communities like this all around the world, not just with reefs, but with other ecosystems, that if we lose them, we're going to see social displacement. We're going to see huge economic, crises, because people are fundamentally reliant on these ecosystems for every part of their life. And so that for me was where I really made a commitment and to lots of areas of my life, but I say the big one was transport. So again, I didn't have a car for a long time. I ensured that I used public transport. I looked at my flight footprint, and that's been something for me that I've really stuck to, even when it's been challenging, but to try and ensure that I'm minimizing my carbon footprint.
Right. I think probably the last question from the audience we'll have time for. It's from Zoe Shu. Can you name one or two people in the field of climate change or environmental preservation who have been your inspirations or mentors? Natalie, was one of yours mentioned in Xiaowei's introduction with the forthcoming trip that you have?
Yep. The forthcoming trip to Antarctica on climate expedition, who's led by Dr. Sylvia Oh. She's actually one of my role models. She is a keen, avid ocean marine biologist, similar to Emma. And she has a quote that says, "Everyone has power, but it doesn't help if you don't use it." And I like to pass this quote to everyone on the call here. I think change starts with ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In the past, I didn't think of starting my own enterprise or educating the public on environmental change. But once I had a small chance, I took it and I started doing what I believe in. So I think every one of you here can take small actions by educating your communities around proper ways to recycle, or about making a greener consumption choice for each meal or for each clothes or piece of fashion item that you buy. And we have the power to execute it and to vote for a better future.
I believe Dr. Sylvia Earle actually is even a Rolex testimony. So very, very apropos of what we're discussing today. She's been spreading this message since way, way, way before it was trendy, right? Since the 80s. So a phenomenal role model. Great pick, Natalie. What about yourself, Em?
Well, obviously Sylvia, and that goes without saying. She would definitely be, for me as a marine biologist, she's just been an amazing role model, and she's held some really prestigious positions in the National Oceanographic Administration in the US. So yeah, but we've heard about Sylvia, so I will give another one, and I will actually say David Attenborough. Not for the reasons that people may think in terms of him being this charismatic, BBC presenter, but for the fact that he has really acknowledged that when he was first starting out, he didn't realize the impact that he was having by visiting and showing the world some of these sites. There's, for example, pictures of him holding coral out of the water and doing things that at the time there wasn't the knowledge there. And he's really now become someone that has been so vocal. He's given some amazing talks at the climate summits saying why we have to leave the world in a better place for future generations. And I feel really taken that commitment to ensure that his legacy is one that is advocating for sustainability, for a complementary existence with nature, and to move away from exploiting it.
Well, we've covered so much ground in the last 40 minutes. It's been such a fascinating conversation filled with insights and sharings. I have a whole list of questions I could go through, but in the service of allowing everybody to go eat some lunch, we'll have to wrap up there. But thank you so much, Dr. Emma Camp and Natalie Chung, for being with us today, for sharing your stories and your insights. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Lee. Thanks so much, Emma, as well as Natalie. So that's all the time that we have for today. Really thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you found the conversation as motivating and as useful as I did. I think the one thing that I got from it today is that what we can all start with is to get informed and perhaps eat more beans, as Natalie mentioned. So, and finally, I would like to thank our partner, Rolex, obviously, for making today possible. So the Rolex Awards for Enterprise 2023 is now open for application, and it is looking for exceptional individuals like Emma, who have solutions to help the world address some of its most urgent challenges. So applications are open until October 17 to anyone above the age of 18, and you can submit yours at the URL that you see on your screen right now. If you're also posting about this session on social media, please tag us at the social handles and use the hashtags that you see on the screen as well. So that's it from us at Gen.T. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at the next Cloud Talk.